let's see. So I think what I'd like to continue next on to is designing kind of our first screen and trying to configure it with a little bit maybe advanced features. Is go back to the MOST designer, and I'm going to create a new screen design. Basically, I'm going to create, let's say, a new scan to folder screen. To do that, I'm going to create a new Ricoh WVGA screen size. And I can either continue with the tab wizard, or if I cancel, it'll show me the tab and I can go through all the properties manually. I'll continue with the wizard for now. So we can start with the name of the tab. And like I said before, the name of the tab will determine the name of the text file that MOST creates for the spooler process. So in turn, that will also determine the name of the form that's going to be created down the road. I'm going to call it scan sample for now. The alias that we get to decide will determine what the user sees on the button for that specific screen when they're looking at the MFP. I'm just going to call it sample for now. Now, when we create a new screen, we can assign it to an existing collection or create a new collection, or don't assign it to anybody. Just to save myself a few steps, I'm going to create a new collection. And I'm going to assign it to the demo user. Now, if, for instance, I made a mistake while setting up the wizard settings, I can always come in the object properties on the bottom right corner here and adjust them as necessary. Now, the first thing I always add to my screen design is the logout button, because when we make changes, logging out and logging back in is kind of critical to make sure those changes take effect. It's always useful to have a logout button on the screen, especially during testing. And once I've dragged the object from the side here onto the screen and go through the wizard, I can then reposition it just by dragging it on the designer. And I can always go back and change the properties using the object properties on the bottom right corner. After the logout button, the next thing I typically add would be the scan button, which is a process button here. And when we choose a process button, we can also determine which other pieces of information we'd like to include in the STL file. For example, if I was doing a scan to email type of workflow, I would probably want to include the email variables with the scan so that I could use that when delivering the document to the email server. Since I'm doing a scan to home folder or scan to folder workflow, I might need the user's domain. I would need the user's home folder. And I think that's all would be required. We'll continue. The next option is the continue prompt, which is similar to the scan preview. It's just slightly quicker and doesn't show the preview of the image. I tend to turn this on, but depending on the user's preference, it's not necessary. Direct copy is a less common feature, but essentially allows the user to scan and copy the document simultaneously if their workflow basically requires them to keep an archive of every document that's copied. This is a useful feature. although it seems to be less common. The scan preview I'll leave off for now since I turned on the continue option earlier. And now we have our scan button. Now, just using as a template the folder screen, the next important piece of information is directory we want to scan to. And to allow the user to browse the directories, we're going to use the tree list box object. Now, continuing through the wizard, the child select option will determine if the user can select folders or files. It kind of restricts what the user can choose. If you're browsing to scan to a folder, typically this should be turned off. I think the most common case where this would be turned on is similar to the SharePoint print screen, where the user would have to select a file to print, and it's not possible for them to select a folder since that wouldn't make sense for the workflow. The process reset option essentially determines whether the object is reset after every scan. Depending on the user's daily activities, this can be useful, either enabled or disabled. If the user typically scans multiple documents using the same information or same selection, we wouldn't want this to reset every time the user scanned because that would require them to re-enter all that information. However, if the majority of the time they were scanning a document for a different information, it might be more convenient to reset it every time they scan to ensure that they re-enter the information as necessary. And then we can choose whether the object is required or not, basically restricting the user to have to select an entry from the list, which I'm going to turn on for this option. Target type we'll leave to none for now. And then for the type of list, we'll just use a file list. The other option is an LDAP home file list, which will automatically browse the home folder. We're going to use a file list so that we can select the directory to browse. And then the directory we want to browse, we can choose the same temp folder that was being used earlier. And we're not going to want to see the files that are within that folder structure. Now, impersonation is something built into MOST for certain features. And essentially what it allows us to do is impersonate the user using their entered credentials. So if I logged in as my domain account, and my domain account had access to a folder structure on the network, maybe a shared folder somewhere, we could impersonate that user using their credentials to also have access to that folder structure to browse it and scan to it. However, in this case, since I'm browsing just a local folder, impersonation is not necessary. Okay, so now at this point I have my folder structure designed on the screen so I can browse it. And we can also place a label next to it just to help instruct the user on what needs to be done. When entering or adding a label to the screen, we can choose either a standard label, which means the text is static and never changes. DLL can be designed to automatically refresh that label on a timer. Or we can show variable information like the user's home folder or email address, similar to what we saw earlier. I'm going to use just a standard label. And the last thing that we need is a text box for the file name. So using the text box object, we're going to add the file name field here. And again, there's different types of text boxes. We have the standard, which is what we're going to use. We have a password text box, which will show asterisk on the MFP screen. So it's essentially like a password field on the website where the information that you type is hidden. Global, which is used to configure global variables, which we're not going to go into now, and it's probably much less common. And a pop-up text box, which allows searching and pop-up lists to be displayed, which is much more advanced than what we'll probably cover today. Now, on the text box, we can also choose the default text that should be entered. I'm going to leave it as blank so that we can set it as required, so the user has to specify the file name manually. And that should be all of the properties we need for this workflow. And in case that helps, we can always copy and paste objects to simplify the design time. Now, using the properties on the bottom right corner of the designer, you'll notice when I go to change the text, it shows this text editor window like we saw earlier. And again, it shows all the different languages available, but as long as English is entered, it'll use that by default if the others are not there. There we go. It does take a few seconds for the server to save and load the changes that are made. So now we have our new collection and our new screen design that matches what we just created. And I'm going to enter a file name. And select a directory. And before I hit scan, I'm going to stop the spooler service again so that I can grab the files before they're processed. Or actually, maybe it's better if I leave it running, because to start configuring this workflow, the first thing we'll want to do is do a scan from that new screen we've just created. Now, we could either stop the spooler service and grab the files before it's processed, but in this case I'm going to let it process just to show what would happen if this did occur. So we'll see the files appear here and quickly disappear. And what occurred in that moment is the reform spooler saw this new file come into the spooler folder. Since we haven't created a form to process that type of data, it used what we call the default form, and essentially just moved it to an unknown folder so it could be looked at later on. So in this case, I haven't harmed anything. It's always good to know the environment before letting the server do something like that. but in my environment here, I knew it was safe to allow it to be processed. Now, that data didn't really go anywhere because we haven't configured it to go anywhere just yet. But if we did want to look at the data that came through, we could look at the reform backups directory. And looking at the SCL file, just like earlier, we should see the information that I entered on the screen. So now that we have data to begin configuring, the next step is to actually set up the workflow that will automatically create the form for us. And to do that, we're going to use the Workflow Designer. The Workflow Designer shortcut is under the base installation. It's installed with the Reform base server. So it doesn't matter which plugins are installed. The Workflow Designer should always be available for you. And we're going to create a new workflow for document automation. And depending on which plugins you have installed, different options will be available on the left side of your screen here. For what we're doing today, we're going to use the input from MOST as the starting point. And I'm going to select that file that contains all the data we just entered so that the Workflow Designer can help us determine how to set up this new environment or this new screen that we've just created. Now, that text file we have designed to go to a folder structure or save to file. And connecting these two not only visually explains what should occur, but it also helps the designer instruct you on how to configure it. So we're going to use a PDF file to continue. Now, the root folder that should be used when we scan from the screen is the folder that the user selected. So rather than entering a static directory, we're going to use the dynamic option here. And we're going to choose this list box because that's what I selected on the screen, and that's what should determine the folder that the document gets stored to. Now, we can also set up subfolders, but when we're dealing with MOST, the folder should really be specified by the user. There are scenarios where we want to dynamically create folder structures, which might be more geared towards document management systems if we wanted to sort documents maybe by company name or order number automatically. This would be where we could specify that. Now, since I'm not going to select a subfolder, I'm going to hit the Stop Looping button. And then I can choose what the file name should be. Now, what you'll notice is all the information that I can choose from is basically all the information that was available in the FCL file. So like I said earlier, as long as the information is in the FCL file, we can use that to help route the document. So the file name I had entered was setup, and we can see that's the text box 1 field. And I'm going to continue with that. And we're not going to do metadata just yet, but hopefully if we have time we can come back to that in a moment. And we're going to skip that. And typically we try not to overwrite files, but the option is there if it's desired. Now, once I have my workflow designed, I can hit the execute button. And what that really does is it'll create a form to match that file that I've created or that workflow that I've created. So if I refresh my form list, we can see a new form has been created called Scan Sample, which matches my new screen design. And that form has been configured to go to Save to File using all the options that I selected using the Workflow Designer. So now if I go back to that folder structure, and do another scan, we can see that the file reaches the destination just like we had originally hoped. So by using the MOST designer in combination with the workflow designer, we're able to create fairly complex workflows. Now this is just a starting point for scanning to a folder, but let's say, for example, we needed to enter additional information to determine a subfolder, or maybe an XML file is needed to go with the document. That's where additional screen design and scripting can play a role.